Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Furudashi podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Ash, here with the lovely Nicholas.
I am lovely today. I'm very beautiful.
He is very lovely. I think the ring light is just shining off his skin in an effervescent way.
Yeah, so like Mr. Pale as Death has like the light from the basement window coming in, and I look like the way Tolkien describes the elves in Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Yeah, the pallor is shining. Anyway, guys, speaking of that, I was like, speaking of that, that's a terrible segue. But moving away from that, I think what we've been talking about lately here is all about friction and user experience design. And we've also kind of talked about the inherent friction that is needed to kind of pull off the game experiences that you want. So in today's podcast, what we're going to do is basically break down why games have friction and also kind of frame it around the difficulty systems or difficulty sliders that you see in games as well. So maybe how inherently, right, games have difficulty because games have challenge, and kind of separating that inherent friction, say from potentially the friction that you might as a user feel when a game doesn't really necessarily click right from the get-go. Exactly. So for us, we're going to kind of go through those games challenges and how friction kind of lends itself to an ideal game experience and work our way through PvE experiences or single player experiences as well, to the subjectivity of difficulty and moving into player versus player experiences. So join us on this ride as we kind of break down game friction, game difficulty, and kind of figuring out, what makes us tick and why we think certain experiences are more difficult or maybe more just unapproachable right from the get-go than others. Because that's really what friction is all about when I think of talking about friction in games. I think of it as a bit unapproachable or unnecessary, maybe even tedious. But we want to break those assumptions out, right?
Yeah, because the thing is so like games aren't difficult just to piss you off. No game design. Well, okay, maybe some like sadistic game designer has sat down and said, "I'm going to make this game so fucking hard that these people are going to shit themselves every single time they sit down to play. They're going to break out."
So like Cuphead.
You're going to break out in nervous sweats as the game loads. No, that's generally not how designers approach their games. And at the same time, they don't want it to be sort of just a free-flowing experience where it feels like nothing you do in the game matters. So in many ways, I guess I could say point number one is that friction exists in games, difficulty exists so as to like give significance to like the gameplay mechanics, to the things that you do in a game. In other words, like it feels different when you beat a boss who was challenging than it does if you beat a boss by like literally just like mashing your face across the keyboard, and it really didn't matter what abilities you use, didn't really matter what order you used them in, it didn't really matter like what your reaction time was, because it was kind of a foregone conclusion that you were going to win. That doesn't feel especially great. And friction is one of the ways in which games like put up, and I think it's really important to sort of like think of it in those terms, precisely because when a game puts up an impediment, it's resisting your forward progress, but it's not trying to stop it. In other words, it's not an impediment. It's not sort of like a roadblock in the strict sense where it's like, thou shalt not pass and you can't go any further, but rather it's kind of like making it a little rough as you try to push, like that initial resistance when you're trying to like push a box across the floor, right. Or that sort of that moment when you first get on a bike and you have to kind of crank down in order to get it going. So then, you can more easily glide afterwards.
Right. And I think Nicholas is really kind of highlighting the difference when we talk about game friction, say, versus game challenge.
Yeah.
So a challenge is like a goal. It's something that immediately you look at and it says plant the bomb in the enemy base. Well, there are challenges, right, along the way. Maybe there are patrolling enemies. Maybe you're supposed to stealth, so you have no gun, right? Having no gun in a combat situation is a challenge,
Yeah.
but it's not friction. The friction element, right, comes in when there's a resistance to you have succeeded in a challenge or you're about to succeed. And there is this level of tension that it does make you sweat, right?
Sometimes, yeah.
But it is a bit of friction into helping you. So maybe in the stealth mechanic, you only can do 100% cover. Like once you dedicate to a cover spot, you're locked into it and then you have to swoop all the way over by pressing a button. Like that type of user experience or interface or control scheme is friction. You can't just move freely,
Yeah.
right? Friction is that inherency, right? Maybe there's a timer when you have to plant the bomb, right? Suddenly you're there, and instead of a new challenge of, hey, just wait for it to load for 30 seconds and now we give you a gun, it's more like, no, you actually have to be very careful or move around, or like it's those little elements that some people could also argue are just obstacles, but I would say it's the inherency of the systems that add to the friction versus the challenges like the content that is inside of that system, right?
Yeah. The timer on planting the bomb is actually a really good example because it's one of those situations where, like, if you have been sneaking around, it exposes you in a way that sort of like your gameplay up to that point was actually trying to subvert. In other words, prior to that moment when you reach the objective and you're sticking the bomb on it and you see the little animation of the guy's hands going beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop and you have to wait essentially. Like the state that you are in as a player is actually fundamentally different from the state you were in immediately prior to it because a certain degree of control has been taken away from you. You are exposed to whatever enemies or sort of like or like dangers that surround you at that moment, and it's all up to whether or not you sort of like accurately timed when exactly you were going to have this moment of vulnerability. That like that's where the tension comes from. Like, did you successfully achieve this in a way that you're not going to be immediately screwed the second you
Right.
expose yourself?
And I think it's those types of one-off experiences and inherent frictions that is what creates that level of tension and satisfaction afterwards. Because if you just complete a series of challenges and a series of checklists, I think this is a lot of times where people feel like it's a checklist design, where they're like, I just need to checklist this off so I can get to the next beat in the story, or I need to checklist this off so I can meet my daily requirements. And it really fundamentally comes down to checklist design versus like actual tension and creating this kind of moment for the player.
Yeah.
Right?
So yeah, because it begs the question as to whether or not you see gameplay as you just said, this sort of like list of objectives, or is gameplay the subjective feel that the player has as they are doing those things? And those two things don't
Right.
necessarily have to be in tension with one another, but it is easy to like not pay enough attention to like the feel of gameplay as it's happening. It's very easy to just get into like the do this thing. Okay, congratulations, here's some loot. Now do the next thing. That's sort of a very boring gameplay loop because it's sort of like putting all of the emphasis on the result rather than on sort of like the journey to getting to that result.
Right. And I don't want to say that either is actually say necessarily evil or bad, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not, they're two different areas. So perfect example of a list of objectives in gameplay that can be good is a lot of people call it mission-based design, where it really is you have to complete a set of missions to get to the end of the story. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, like Uncharted is a list of objectives, but it combines that with the amount of challenges and friction of completing those puzzles, of completing those encounters, right?
Yeah.
And so I just want everyone to understand that when we look at objective based gameplay versus say subjective gameplay, like they're both pretty much used in tandem throughout experiences. So while we are saying that like there is this binary that exists, it's kind of we're using them as the hyperboles. Look,
Yeah.
if you just look at gameplay as please complete these 3 daily chores, that will get boring and tedious. And a lot of end games of like the end game of MMOs, right, becomes the do your day 3 dailies, right?
Yeah.
But they only work if the subjective experience of playing those games makes sense. And I think that was missed in a lot of people that did the WoW clones, because the end game of WoW with the raid, subjectively doing a raid, had some good feelings of gameplay.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah,
then
because you
you
have to get
needing
in.
and
Yeah.
and then you
Because
needing to do it, right, made
yeah.
it worthwhile. And people
Yeah.
didn't think, oh, like the objectives came after, right? The good experience. And I think a lot of people tend to do, let's make an end game where we need to complete 3 raids. And you don't realize, well, no, the raid has to be good. And it seems dumb when I say it out loud like this on a podcast, guys. But quite frankly, I want you to know that making games is very hard. And
Yeah.
especially at like any leadership level, right? So just, this is not to critique any game or anything out there. It's just like, guys, game's hard.
Yeah, because the thing is, like, so actually, the daily quest and the raid as like these periodic exercises are really good examples of how friction really sort of lies within the realm of execution rather than sort of like accomplishment. Because the if you're to be honest, like sometimes daily quests in MMOs can be tedious, like they are a time gating function at the end of the day. um However, raids in particular, like they are also time gated usually. But if you look at games like Destiny 2 or even the World of Warcraft, the monster that it is, um, part of the experience of the raid isn't just the how should I put it, like the movement towards getting loot or the movement towards defeating the boss. In other words, like the sort of the basic progress curve, but it's like, are you skilled enough or have you like learned fights sufficiently that you can execute it to a particular level? And it's that degree of execution where a lot of like the interest and the joy lies. And the problem is that the reason why raids can sometimes become boring is because that execution element becomes trivialized. In other words, the friction is reduced and you sort of like glide seamlessly through a raid, almost not even paying attention because you're just like essentially playing from muscle memory. Like that's not necessarily a particularly enjoyable subjective experience. Then you literally are just doing it for the time gating reason of like, this boss has this particular piece of loot that you need in order to fully progress your character. That
No,
doesn't always feel great.
exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel great, right? And that's why people call about it gear grinding, right? But I know
Yeah.
tons of people that gear grind in Destiny 2, and the subjective experience of gear grinding and the like cheeses, quote unquote, a cheese is basically a strategy that the developers didn't 100% make implicit to you, but allow you to do because it is a clever and easier way of defeating a challenge. That is
Yeah.
now the official definition of a cheese. And there are many cheese strategies throughout not only Destiny 2, but also Baldur's Gate 3,
Oh yeah.
because of they've come from Larian's like Divinity Original Sin 2 and other, their other properties, that you look at it in a tactics game strategy that you're going, there's always a cost to doing a cheese, even if it's easier or even if it, or maybe it takes longer, right? But it's just a more
Yeah.
efficient way for you as the player in that moment, right? To lower the difficulty yourself, or you end up increasing the friction in a boss fight so that you
Yeah.
can lead them away just so you can shove them off a rooftop or something. But I'm just bringing the cheese nature up because I think that whenever I think about friction and I think about the subjectivity of it, Nicholas is right in that it's about the execution, not just from the developer side. What is
Yeah.
the friction? It's now the kind of response and the execution from the player side, and how are they dealing with that? And so with this kind of like mentality of cheesing now, Nicholas, I wanted us to go into that wonderful title that we really love, Baldur's Gate
Yeah.
3, because you just completed your honor mode run.
A while
And I
ago.
am
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
a while ago, and I am still in the Act 2 honor mode run. I finally got to Act 3 in my single player game. I just need to actively make more time to play.
Yeah, it was so yeah. So I as a kind of preface, I feel like I need to explain that I was sort of taken aback by how difficult some people felt Baldur's Gate 3 is, because at no point like playing it have I ever felt like it was an especially difficult game. And I don't really know why that is. Like, I played a little Divinity Original Sin 2, but not a lot. So I'm not super familiar with like that structure. I have played, plenty of other CRPGs throughout, my time on this earth. But like to me, it's possible that because like, well, I mean, I am a little bit of a power gamer when it comes to RPGs. I'm not going to lie. I like to exploit really sort of broken mechanics and especially like really broken synergies. Um, and I like to research those things, and I like to execute them, and to find all of the bizarre items and put them together in strange ways so as to create possibly intended, possibly not intended interactions. And so when it came to sort of like the difficulty of honor mode, for those of you who aren't familiar, in Baldur's Gate 3, they added honor mode about 6 months after the game had already been out for full release. And essentially, what it was is that it was sort of a combination of an Iron Man mode. You get a single recurring save, it auto saves, and if you die, you're screwed. Like, that's it. Um, they did eventually change it so that like it gives you the option of converting the honor mode save into a regular tactician save, so that way like you can keep playing it at least, but it won't give you any of the rewards that you get for completing the game in honor mode. um, in that instance, like, so what's interesting is how it encouraged for me a very different type of play style. Like when I first played Baldur's Gate 3, I played in a fairly like, I didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. Like, I played my wizard the way you would expect to play a wizard in 5e. You got your spells, you do your long rests. But when I was doing some research on like other people and how they had done their honor mode runs, one of the things I came across were these builds that were all around like racking up as many buffs throughout the game that only last a single long rest, but then never long resting. And what's really interesting about this is that this sort of like self-imposition, in other words, the quote unquote cheesy strategy, actually added friction to the gameplay. Because the thing is, like, it puts a lot more emphasis on keeping your individual party members alive, and also adopting strategies where, like, especially say in boss fights, you might actually leave one of your party members outside of the boss fight. And the reason for that is that if you wipe, you can then take that one remaining person, go back to your camp, and revive everybody. And so, like,
Oh, hell yeah.
that is a cheesy strategy, I admit. But it, like I said, it forces you to adopt a very different form of gameplay that actually heightens the tension. It doesn't actually lower it.
So let's actually really go into that, because the honors mode run I'm playing is actually 4-player multiplayer honors mode. And
you must hate yourself. You must really hate yourself.
Okay, we've got a technical artist rigger. We've got a I'll just say director in games. We've got a build engineer, and we've got a like senior combat designer. So like we're both super stacked, but also yes, we all hate ourselves. Hence why we're still in Act 2, but it's because I basically forced us. I was like, we are skipping this content. We are moving on. And I have to really break down that strategy of leaving a party member out, because in multiplayer, you're actually leaving one of your team members potentially out of an encounter.
Yeah.
Right? Now, even in single player, though, I want you to know honor mode is the hardest difficulty. So it's going to increase friction in a lot of ways, or at least let's say increases challenges and increases difficulty settings, right?
Yeah.
But in a flip side, it also makes it easier in some areas where if enemies have legendary buffs or will behave in erratic ways, that erraticy, that's not a word, that erraticism, erratic, maybe it's just erratic. That erratic, whatever. That erratic nature of their style of gameplay could actually work in your favor. So for example, we had, actually can't remember it now, but basically we had something where wild magic was on on the enemies, like something they would do something chaotic. And that was just completely random. But what wild magic does is it turned everyone into cats in honor mode run, and the enemies did it. And so as they were killing us, we were like, oh, well, we're cats now. We can just kind of run away.
Yeah.
And that creates, a semblance of, while it was tense, it actually worked in our favor. But on the flip side, when you leave, I got on a little bit of a tangent there. I apologize. But that's important, because when you are dynamically at that difficulty, when you are dynamically kind of creating a combat scenario like that, when Nicholas says, this is the hardest mode, this is honor mode, and it's like permadeath save, leaving a member out seems like a wise strategy, but all of these fights are tuned for 4 characters.
Yeah.
And so when you are one man down, it is really the difference between life and death. And
Yeah.
yet, in an honor mode run, it's sometimes, like he's saying, is working in your favor because you can keep your save by keeping someone that may not be the best for that fight out of it. And then if you're winning, you can try to pull them in. But you never know in the situation if you should or shouldn't. And so I think
have an
that
example of this. So
right.
when you get,
so please give that example.
Okay, so in Baldur's Gate 3, in Act 2, the boss at the end of Act 2 is sort of a combo of Ketheric Thorm, and then once you get him down to a certain... Well, actually, you fight him functionally 3 times. You fight him once in Moonrise Towers, and he does the classic boss of like, oh, you have damaged me, ha ha ha, I'm going to run away. And so then you chase him into the gooey brain sludge rooms. And then at the very bottom of the gooey brain sludge rooms, you fight him as an undead, technically, I guess he is. Again, as a humanoid. Again, and then you get him down to a certain health level, and he's like, ha ha ha, I'm going to transform into a big bony guy. And the big bony guy is really, really hard. Not the least of which being that the particular strategy that I had adopted for one of my characters in my party was that I was focusing on like really high damage, like stealth archer build. So, but Merkel, the big bony guy that you fight, he's immune to piercing damage. so your big like archer strategy is fucked. So I actually I had to figure out a fundamentally different way to do it. And luckily for me, I had been preparing throughout the course of my run an oh shit mechanism in case I ran into a boss that I couldn't defeat otherwise, which is I had been collecting all of the various like AoE damage items that exist in the game. So like, smoke powder barrels, alchemist fire, and also holy water as well. Because one of the things that you can do, I mean, it's an extremely cheesy strategy, but it is the one, in many ways, like the fact that I was boned by the way in which the difficulty of this particular boss. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, pun intended, by the way.
Pun intended.
That I was literally boned by this particular boss fight. Is it actually pushed me towards the more like the ultimate cheesy strategy, which is to use a bunch of like smoke powder bombs and the alchemist fire and the holy water as like one just huge like nuclear explosion to kill this guy, precisely because I had limited my own options by my own cheesy strategies. And so like and this is what I meant earlier about sort of like it actually kind of heightens a lot of the friction and a lot of the difficulty in the execution, because if you create these super like power gamer optimized builds, they often have one extremely glaring weakness. And then if the boss in question happens to counter that one specific weakness, you then have to fundamentally rethink your strategy. And it creates a kind of gameplay that, at least for me, is very rewarding, because it's not just about, did I mash button at the right time? It's like, did I think through all of the little pieces that have to go together in this fight? And then did I execute them properly so as to make sure that this plan that I came up with actually works and that I don't screw myself over in a different way? Like, to me, and like the way I particularly like to play games, that is a really enjoyable form of gameplay. Whereas like the did I mash button at the right time is not a particularly enjoyable form of gameplay. So like there's this marriage of the way in which the difficulty is presented and the particular play style that I have like an affinity for.
Right. And I actually want to also go into this as well when we look at Baldur's Gate's difficulty settings, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the inherent friction, honors mode being the most difficult. But if we look at story mode versions of all of our games now, right, is that those types of difficulty modes are almost the most challenging to actually design for. I think easy mode, a lot of people assume, well, to be fair, back in the day, easy mode was just let's turn damage down, let's turn health up, let's do some very simple things, and those are all good, right?
Yeah.
But you have a player type now, particularly, that it's not about going easy, right? It's talking about story or campaign mode, right?
Yeah.
And it's less about, I think, the health and damage numbers, because you still want it to be an enjoyable friction experience. You still want players to feel like things were challenging. And I think Baldur's Gate 3 did an excellent job in their story mode, where I still feel like encounters, because of all of the friction of the systems, can be difficult, particularly for me when I'm just really tired. Like, I have been playing Baldur's Gate 3 since fall of 2020. So for me, I have been playing, and I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons longer. I played Divinity Original Sin 2. I mean, it's it was a long, arduous, I don't know, I have a history with game types like these. And even I, on a very exhausting day, go, you know what? I really just need to finish this gosh darn story. I'm going to turn it down to story mode in Act 3. I'm just going to barrel through this because I have 4 different concurrent games of Baldur's Gate 3. I got to get through one of them. Yeah. And that's just what you do. And what I found is that on the flip side, the difficulty might be turned down, but the friction still exists.
Yeah.
And so one of the best kind of examples I have is actually very early on in the game, where there are so many ways to kind of trigger a combat encounter or get out of a combat encounter with this type of bandit group that's in front of a church. I bring that up because there's so many different ways to either start combat, get rid of people, kind of find your way into the church, because there's another combat encounter inside of it.
Yeah.
And these two kind of combat encounters kind of marry really well between honors mode and story mode. In story mode, the difficulty checks are a lot easier to kind of convince them to leave, right? But say you're just playing your murder hobo run on story mode. Yeah. You just you're going to go into combat encounter. You can shoot down a kind of crate and then kill them on the spot, which feels very rewarding. But then the mage ends up seeing you guys right away, and it is very tricky to not get hit by any of the mage's spells. Yeah. So you kind of have to go around in that area. And I think that still, right, provides friction. It provides challenge. It provides a level of stress that even if you're on a story mode campaign, you still feel the same level of accomplishment and success. Yeah. And the reason why this is important is that level of accomplishment, that level of success, game design inherently is about presenting strategies and challenges that you need to work around. And some of the worst story modes I've played are where I would get to a combat encounter and I just do one quick shot to the boss, and then he keels over and dies. Yeah. Maybe that works in a hero game. Like, maybe if I was Batman and I just punch Joker in the face, okay, I get it. But it becomes really cheesy when, say, Joker has a 3. This is not a real game, by the way. This was never in a Batman game. Unless it was, in which case I didn't play it, so I'm sorry. But if I was Batman, even in a superhero game, right, where I have a 3-phase boss fight, because all boss fights have 2 or 3 phases, and I just do 1, 2, 3 punches, that is very anticlimactic, right? It doesn't feel satisfying. And then I get the story of oh, it took so long to get here and you finally beat me. And it's oh, I beat you in 3 punches, man. See, that feels bad. I don't feel like I got accomplishment, but I did get a story, right? Yeah. Or I got the cutscene, I guess is what I should say. And so I think that Baldur's Gate 3's story mode even actually does a really inherent job of showing that really good differentiation between what do we mean when we say there's difficulty, right? But also what do we mean when we say there's friction, right? It's the friction is the systems inside of it. So it always leads to that sense of accomplishment, right? Even if this isn't your type of game, because now once you've done story mode, maybe you'll go, hey, that was a really approachable medium for me and I want to play it again. Maybe I should play it on normal because now I know what to expect.
Yeah. Well, and the thing, especially in the case of BG3, the difficulty settings primarily affect the math, the underlying math. What it doesn't change is a lot of the fundamentals of how the systems themselves work. So, for example, to use Lauren's example, those guys that you encounter in front of the church, it is possible to talk your way through that. But the thing is, even if the game reduces the ability check DC all the way down to 2, which is the minimum it can be in Baldur's Gate 3, you still actually have the chance to fail. And if you do fail, sure, you could reload and redo it until you succeed the encounter, but the feeling that you have when you get that critical failure, it's ah. And so the thing is, that feeling is exactly the same as if you had failed that skill check on Tactician. precisely because the friction exists within sort of like the structure of the way the systems are designed, rather than in like math is bigger or math is smaller, which I think is a kind of really easy and almost sort of like overly simplistic way of approaching difficulty. A much more interesting way of approaching difficulty is in thinking about sort of like the structure of gameplay and the underlying systems. So another example, a game that I recently played and love and want to talk about for a whole set of unrelated reasons, are the two Hellblade games. So Senua's, what's the first one? Senua's Sacrifice and Senua's Saga is the second one. And what's interesting in those two games is that they don't have difficulty settings. There just is the way the game is. And combat in that game is not especially difficult. The challenge lies in the way in which combat is kind of orchestrated, and sort of like the way in which it expects you to learn how to approach an encounter. It also assumes that you're going to fail. Like there's a system built into the game where like failure accumulates. So like if you screw up the way you're supposed to fight a particular enemy and you die, then you will respawn back to a point just before that fight. But the game will remember that you failed. And if you fail too much, then you can sort of get an ultimate like game over failure. But the way in which the system is structured, the way it sort of like expects or allows for you to fail, it's saying, we want you to learn from this. In other words, we want you to go into this combat encounter. It's actually okay if you don't understand everything that's going on, because since the game is so focused on like perception and how you see things, it wants you to examine what's going on, and it allows and it gives you the space in which to do that. The game is not itself super difficult. Ultimately, you can fail in the same way that, say, in like story mode, you can fail an ability check because there is always that 5% chance that you just don't succeed. But in both of those cases, it's the friction lies in the way in which the systems have sort of like set out a gameplay path for you, rather than just like this boss has a bajillion health and they hit you for a bajillion damage. Like to me, that's less interesting than saying like the difficulty lies in, did you actually understand what this game is doing? Do you understand the way in which it wants you to play? That's a more interesting way to approach friction, at least in my opinion. Lauren is
I love that.
mesmerized.
I am mesmerized. No, I think that for me, I wrote down the question actually. I always like to take notes during our podcast session because it actually just kind of helps reframe the topics I wanted to talk about. And do you understand what the game is doing? Is also really well worded by game design kind of principles, where it's like, do you understand intuitively what you need to do next without reading objective text?
Yeah.
So this comes up a lot in narrative design or also in level design, where Half-Life 2 is still the ultimate example for me because it's kind of the biggest one that I've played, where I think every player playing Half-Life 2 kind of inherently gets through kind of contextual level design clues as well as dialogue that they need to kind of progress the level, or they need to solve a puzzle, or there's something that needs to happen. So it's very simple when you're playing through like their jet ski level and you come to a kind of wall and your way gets locked down because they're like, we're building up the dam so you can't get through. So obviously you hear, don't let him get through. And then you're like, that means I should get through. And that's really dumb. And I say it's dumb. It's very simple. It's a very simplistic tactic. And I think that, are you understanding what the game is wanting you to do? And are you playing into that? And how are you playing into that? Also comes down into the freedoms player feel and the agency players feel, even in games where it is highly tactical or highly stressful. And is very much about the affordances that you have to find out in the world, whether by weapon crafting, item crafting, getting loot, talking to NPCs. Even in these experiences, you can really kind of boil it all down to how much does the player feel like they're able to inherently grok about the game? Or inherently, do they need to go look up on a wiki article how to defeat the boss? Both of these are honestly fine, because I think in the modern day kind of gaming age, game developers, even like myself, can rely on, we made this a little bit challenging. But unfortunately, in this more corporate hellscape that we live in, we're going to have to rely on Reddit and Wiki to help people get through this part. But that means that there will be a player type out there that can inherently grok through it and get through that player type, right?
And is
Whenever I
interested in
think,
doing that. Yeah.
and they're interested in doing that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's where the malleability and the extensibility of game design comes down to. And so that kind of functionality of friction, right? Like you cannot ask the question, do I understand what the game wants me to do now, if the game itself doesn't have something it wants you to do. And I think that what's really interesting about this is in more open world games, sometimes that question gets lost. There is always a right answer. There just might be multiple journeys to get to that right answer. I want to kill the demon boss, but how do you want to kill the demon boss? Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of exists in, I think, every single game in that concept, right? Of the demon boss could be, the Joker if you're playing a Batman game. It could be Catherick Thorne, the Bone Dragon, if you're playing Baldur's Gate 3. It could be a myriad of things, right? If you're playing Candy Crush, it could be I want to get to the next level, right? But how do you choose to do that? We won't actually be going into those types of like match 3 or gotcha games here, in that that's a different upsetting category for how that
their
journey.
friction. Yeah, unfortunately, their friction exists for maybe not a great reason.
Their friction exists for not a great reason, but you see now that it's friction, you would never consider that challenging, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I brought it up. Is that also here's another additional example of game genres where you're going, oh shit, that isn't a challenge. It's just friction. And now you can see why, if you just encounter friction without that challenge, without that kind of game designing and systems that have inherency friction, why you would be frustrated as a player, why you're upset by loot boxes. You're not upset by loot boxes because you don't like getting rewards. You're upset because it might be the only obstacle standing in your way that doesn't have anything to do about the game.
Yeah.
So, Nicholas, I actually want to kind of backpedal here and go to, or kind of switch gears, because that's why I wrote down your question, but kind of switch gears away from Hellblade. And I actually want to talk more about From Software games, because I think those, when we look at really great systems with an inherent friction that actually for some people Bloodborne was a little bit more approachable, and others who had never played From Software games really grokked Elden Ring in a way that was a bit surprising to me. And so I kind of want to talk about the inherent friction that we've seen in kind of those titles, and how it can also then maybe, unfortunately, right, lead into that tedium of game design.
Yeah. So I think to address sort of like the implicit question of like, why is it that Elden Ring had a much broader appeal than, say, like Dark Souls 2 or any of the Demon Souls games? I think the reason for that is because of the way in which Elden Ring was much more narratively focused. And so the thing is that, like, there's kind of lore and narrative that underlies Dark Souls 2, but you get it in these little snippets, and it's mostly like you only get it if you read like the flavor text on a ring. There's not really a ton going on in game that sort of like explains to you why you're doing it. In those instances, the focus is, in other words, in the Dark Souls games, the focus is far more on sort of like the brutality of gameplay itself, and the degree of difficulty you decide to take on and the challenge you take on, because you want that, like, oh my god, it's so fucking hard, but when I finally do it, it feels really great experience. Whereas in Elden Ring, it still takes that sort of like basic From Software building block of like you will be allowed to make things really difficult on yourself, but it crafts a world and a narrative structure around that kind of gives you purpose and motivation and fundamentally understanding for why certain things are particularly difficult. Like if you encounter a giant boss out in the open and like you just have no idea what to do with it, in that instance, like the game has scaffolded sort of either through cutscenes or just through like narrative bits that play out a way for understanding like why you're fighting this particular character, and sort of like gives you that little extra push to get through it, because it's like, okay, I want to know what's going on with this particular weird giant thing that I am now fighting, rather than just like I'm fighting it because the fighting for me is challenging and therefore fun. That is more sort of like in the Dark Souls 2 camp, where it's ultimately about like, did you remember that there's a trap right there and you had to avoid it? Like you just have to memorize that it's there, remember, and avoid it. Or like this particular boss does this thing, I have to run away, come back in. It's fundamentally about like, it's entirely on the question of execution. Whereas in the case of Elden Ring, there is a marriage of execution and like sort of more objective, and that's not really objective focus, but sort of like the reward for why you are executing these things in this way in the first place. And Elden Ring has a lot of replayability because it still has that Dark Souls aspect to it. It still has that fundamental replayability that comes with sort of like opting into particular degrees of challenge. But for a broader audience, it also has sort of like a rich structure of lore and also is presenting it to you in like digestible ways that you get as you play the game rather than having to sort of like seek it out or look it up on a wiki or, whatever. But sorry, that was the tangent.
Okay.
I need to
That was the
return
tangent.
I need to return to the
Yeah,
actual
I would
question.
say just really quickly there, though, is that I think what's really impressive about Elden Ring and why I really wanted it to get Game Narrative of the Year was because Elden Ring created. Created. I was going to say crafted.
Yeah,
Elden Ring crafted a narrative experience that I think really underscores kind of the fundamental reason why humans as writers is so important to the games industry, but kind of showcases that you can take a really great game system and craft this kind of digestible lore and world and narrative around it that kind of enhances the flavor of the gameplay.
yeah,
Right. But the gameplay itself has to exist. The gameplay itself gives affordances for a certain type of narrative.
yeah,
And so if any other person I think had existed or any other say company had kind of reached out to George R. R. Martin for this type of world or this type of experience, I think that we would have gotten a really different right narrative or a wrapper for it. So they're just kind of
yeah,
going to create that that kind of end tangent note there.
yeah,
So when it comes to the From Software's kind of tedium or it's the friction that is inherently there, I'm glad that Elden Ring is a bit more approachable in that regard because Dark Souls 2 does feel very like rote memorization. And
yeah,
that was the problem that I really struggled with is that anytime a game asks me to memorize something about it, I will put it down and then I'll come back and then I'll just put it down again. Like I will
yeah,
forget what I
yeah,
remembered, right? And what am I supposed to
yeah,
do? Like sorry, I just moved my mic. Keep a log of every single action I have taken in that game. Like that's cool if it was like a mystery game for me, right?
yeah,
But like a point and click, maybe a Salmon Max, Grim Fandango, right? Like that's a game where I'm like, okay, this game is slow enough that I can take notes and be like, oh right, I have to click on this to get this because this person said X. That's a journal exists for a reason, but not like heat of combat. Oh shit, you're right. There's a trap there, right?
yeah.
Like it's just
Well, because
doesn't grok it for me.
I think the expectation that the gameplay sets up is the sort of like the beating your head against a wall. It's like, okay, we go again. Okay, we go again. Okay, we go again. And you keep doing it. You keep going, you keep going, you keep going until you achieve whatever degree of success you're actually going for, or until you get so frustrated that you just, rage quit. And so like it sets those up as the parameters. It's like, but in order to like in other words, setting up the possibility that your player is just going to rage quit also creates the possibility for that player who just wants to go hard again and again and again. Like, that is the only opportunity that the person who likes that particular gameplay style really has, because that's not most games. That's a very limited number of games. And it's important to have games like that precisely because, like, you don't want to just flatten all gameplay styles. And that's really important. So that's why I think we've been emphasizing this notion of like the ways in which friction manifests in a game is because you want to understand what kind of player you're trying to appeal to, and that may not necessarily be like a huge audience. It could be a large subset of quote unquote gamers, or it might be a smaller one. But in each instance, it's the designer trying to actually think fundamentally about the user experience of the game, not just like, oh, is this mechanic cool or is this game fun in these sort of generic terms. It's really thinking about like the person playing and what they want out of the gameplay experience.
Spoken like a true user experience designer.
Yeah, that's like yeah, the UX Nicholas was like, oh, excuse me, let me put my UX hat on so I can UX this UXy.
No, and I mean honestly, the word friction, I feel like it came from game design, but then really entered our lexicon through user experience design. Because what does your player want, and what will stand in their way with good friction?
Yeah.
Right. To prevent them from getting what they want, so that when they do get what they want, they're super happy about getting what they want. Right.
Well, and also because the difficulty itself may in fact be the what they want. And in other words, there's a paradigm in which you can think of gameplay as like the difficulty is the tedium you expect the player to overcome before they get to the what they want thing. But what we're trying to say is that like we're now in a stage of game design where like theoretically things have developed to the point where you actually understand how the structure of difficulty itself is a what you want. And that is a much more sophisticated way of thinking about design rather than the sort of like almost formulaic, like, oh, it's hard, but if you suffer, you get the thing.
Yep. Just like life. And I think with that, we're actually going to end on the subjectivity of difficulty, right?
Yeah.
Is that what is the difficulty of that what you want, right? We've talked about the approachability of kind of difficulty sliders going down, and that they shouldn't be actually reducing the friction, even if they may reduce, say, the challenge rating or the challenge level, right?
Yeah.
But they do not actually reduce friction, as well as a lot of players like Nicholas and I, who are really familiar with, say, Baldur's Gate 3 systems, are seeking, right, a higher level of difficulty that also sometimes creates erratic player strategies on our end, right? And also creates erratic enemy behavior that is just now novel, right? So we're actually seeking a higher, say, challenge, but the kind of amount of friction, those systems don't change. This friction still exists.
Yeah.
It just gets, right, potentially harder.
Yeah.
So I think the subject...
Sorry, go ahead. We always do this to each other. I was just going to add that like the fundamental quality of like the way friction works its way into the design, like that remains the same. Like even if you're changing parameters that surround it, that can have an influence on it, surely. But like the nature of it, like its fundamental quality remains the same. And that's precisely why it doesn't disappear when the parameters around it change.
Yep. I think that's really important. I kind of would want to end there, but I do want to make sure we get an example of what you talked about with the friction and the parameters. Even if the difficulty changes, the friction doesn't change. And I think I'm going to go, I still want to kind of just talk about PvE or PvP design. So player versus player. And I want to really briefly just talk on this literally to wrap us up here, to kind of really showcase the subjectivity of difficulty while friction still exists with fighting games.
Yeah.
I think it's a very safe thing where people understand and underscore that like, well, fighting games are difficult. And obviously it is easier to play against an AI than it is against another player, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the super highlight of friction for me, because fighting games always share mechanics for every single type of character.
Yeah.
And characters that you gravitate towards, fighting games have done a really great job of going, hey, if you're new to this game, choose an all-arounder, a character that's kind of good at everything. If maybe you're an expert player, they're like, choose the thing that's really hard, like all aerials. You have to jump into the air in order to defeat your opponent. Yeah. And there's this inherent kind of language when we talk about fighting games, because as soon as you jump into the air, that's actually a moment of vulnerability for you. It means that you have to perform a more difficult combo or more mashing buttons, right, in a specific order in order to get the thing you want, and you have to time it very well.
Yeah.
And the reason why this is important is that there is an inherent friction, not only in, say, local play for fighting games. So maybe you're both at the arcade machine, or you have local co-op because you brought your fight sticks, you're having a local fighting match, but also online, there's going to be this inherency of lag, right? And it's about reducing that friction of lag to actually increase the friction of the match itself. And the
Yeah.
reason why I'm now wanting to bring up the PvP space is that fighting games just give a really great base lexicon that if you look up about fighting game design, you're going to immediately understand the difference between challenge, friction, and tedium, right? Learning all of these combos is very tedious.
Yeah.
That's, once again, like I said, anytime a game makes me do rote memorization, for some reason combos are okay. And I love the Devil May Cry series for this reason. As you can see, I'm actually an aerial player despite not being the best fighting game player. But it's because there's this very sophisticated level of going, hey, I have overcome the game's friction of learning the combos,
Yeah.
right? So that when I go and play a match, now the strategy is which set of combos do I use in which order? Or how do I react against another player? Or how do I react against another AI?
Yeah.
And there isn't a difficulty slider on fighting games because they're physically campy. It's very competitive. It's a fighting game.
Yeah.
So because there's a lack of, say, innate difficulty setting, you're able to really see how the opponent or the AI creates a sense of challenge by that inherent set of friction. And I think it's just so different than the single player kind of examples and the kind of tactical strategy examples we've been doing that I think it's worthwhile calling out in the episode, even if we don't kind of dig into it, because
Yeah.
fighting games they have been studied and researched, and you can very easily go from whether it's Guilty Gear Street Fighter to Super Smash Bros. Melee. Like you can absolutely see kind of the same affordances and friction in those matches. And some of you, if you've ever gone to a Super Smash Bros. Competition, absolutely know it's different than playing with like your parents on the GameCube and your sister, back 10 years ago. Versus, actually, I don't know how old the GameCube is now.
Well, yeah, because the thing is, like, if you're doing, especially if you play predominantly in the context of, say, like your friends, if you're just much better at like executing the game's mechanics than your friends are, then you find yourself in a situation where you're just kind of smashing them over and over and over again, and therefore, like, the feeling that is inherent in like the friction of the game, because it's so dependent upon that other player, like it's just kind of absent. But one of the things that, especially like in the modern games context, that has evolved to deal with that, is particularly in online play, is matchmaking systems. Matchmaking systems nowadays do a really, really good job of finding almost that like perfect friction point for each individual player, because what it does is it has a large pool of other players and it literally matches them up so that they're at a roughly similar, like, I don't want to say skill level, it's more like execution level, their ability to execute given the particular like characters that they choose and the particular play style that they have. And so then by matching them up, like the sort of the impediment, such as it is, to like victory, because that's really what the game is about, it's about winning, um, is very evenly matched to the relative like skill of, so the capability of the players. Whereas if you're in a situation where you're like playing, I don't know, Street Fighter 2 against your grandma, like she may really love the game, she may think the characters are really cute, but she's probably older than you, and like her reaction time is just not as great, and you might like trounce her every single time, but she loves you because you are her grandchild.
Exactly. And I think that's the point, right? Is that when we look at a PvP game, right? Whether it's a Call of Duty PvP or whether it's a fighting game, it's Super Smash Bros. And you're playing with your grandma, or you're playing Lovers in a Dangerous Space Time, right? Like you've got all of these different games with all of these different areas. And I just think that it's a beautiful way when you look at friction, that it's so easy for us to look at friction in very specific single player titles that we can pick apart. We have to remember that friction exists in all types of games and in all types of genres, right? And the fundamental quality of this friction always remains the same, that even as our challenges decrease or increase, right, around it, the friction and the systems are still there. So Nicholas, wrap us up really quickly with more of your wisdom, and we'll leave you beautiful people to kind of go look at all of your games, hopefully in a different light, with looking at friction in your games, not as something to be avoided, but as something to be admired.
Yeah, I think the point I really want to end on is actually exactly that. It's this idea that like the structure of difficulty, what we have been calling like friction throughout this entire episode, is not this thing that you're going to present to your player, whether you're designing or whether you're just thinking about analyzing games. It's not something you present to the player as something that they have to suffer through, but actually start to think about it as something that might be valuable to them in the gameplay experience. In other words, if you focus on the way in which friction manifests from the structure of gameplay, from a game's systems, rather than just like, oh, I made the numbers big, you will actually start to see that it's about this kind of delicate dance between you as the designer, or sort of the person who thinks about games, and the person who plays. You start to put yourself in this kind of like, how should I put it? Superposition, where like you are simultaneously designer and player. And how like the interplay between those two things is like increasing the fundamental like joy and pleasure that someone gets out of a game, rather than being like, hey, I screwed you over, here's your loot box. I don't like designing that way. I know Lauren doesn't like designing that way. And we would really like for you to sort of like maybe unpack why that is such like a common structure in like especially mainstream games, and why maybe that's not the greatest. And so with that, I think we're going to leave you, lovely people. We're at nearly an hour now. I just want to remind you that we have a Substack. It is gamedesigndiscourse.substack.com. You can also get there by just going to gamedesigndiscourse.com. It will route you to the same place. We're not terribly active on Twitter anymore, but if you want to follow us on Twitter, it's at FootyDashiPod. And also we have a Patreon if you want to help us keep the lights on and pay for, our hosting costs. I do a bonus episode every month. Currently, we're discussing Scott Shell's The Art of Game Design. If you pay $5 a month, you get access to those new Patreon episodes, as well as the entire backlog of Patreon episodes, which is now we've been doing this for 4 years. It's really extensive. Like there's a lot of really great stuff there, a lot of really great things on all sorts of topics related to games and game design that you may desire to listen to. And with that, I would like to leave you all to your day. Happy Father's Day. We're recording this on Father's Day, to everyone who celebrates. And if you're not a father, or if you don't feel particularly great about the parental situation in your life, we're also thinking about you too, because you matter as well.
Well, happy Father's Day, and see you next time.